When you pick up Plato's Republic, what do you see? Most readers find systematic arguments about justice, clear proposals for an ideal state, straightforward philosophical positions. But what if I told you that this superficial reading blinds you to the text's true teaching? What if Plato deliberately planted contradictions, impossibilities, and absurdities to signal that his real message lies beneath the surface? After decades of teaching students to read with suspicion, I discovered that the greatest philosophers were also the most cunning writers. They had to be. In ages of persecution, when dangerous truths could cost you your life, wise men learned to hide their most radical insights in plain sight. Today, we'll explore why I taught every student to approach classical texts as detective stories, where the most obvious interpretation is almost certainly wrong, and where the philosopher's real teaching emerges only when you learn to read between the lines. The art of esoteric writing isn't just historical curiosity, it's the key to unlocking wisdom that remains as dangerous today as it was 25 centuries ago. Chapter 1: The Necessity of Concealment in Philosophical Writing. When I first began my careful study of medieval Islamic and Jewish philosophy, I noticed something peculiar. These great thinkers, Maimonides, Averroes, Al-Farabi, would often present arguments that seemed to contradict each other within the same work. At first, I assumed this was simply careless writing or perhaps corruption in the manuscripts. But as I read more carefully, I realized these contradictions were systematic, deliberate, and purposeful. They were signals. Consider Maimonides in his Guide of the Perplexed. He explicitly warns his readers that his book contains contradictions, some apparent, some real. He tells us that one type of contradiction serves to protect dangerous truths from the multitude, while another type leads serious readers toward deeper understanding. This wasn't accidental confusion, it was sophisticated pedagogy combined with philosophical prudence. The historical reality these philosophers faced was persecution. Not merely the threat of academic disagreement or professional ostracism, but genuine persecution, exile, death, the burning of books and sometimes their authors. When Averroes's works were burned in Cordoba, when Maimonides was forced to flee from one city to another, when countless philosophers found themselves caught between the demands of reason and the requirements of religious or political orthodoxy, they developed a solution: esoteric writing. But this raises a crucial question. If medieval philosophers needed to write esoterically due to persecution, what about ancient philosophers like Plato and Aristotle? Surely they enjoyed greater freedom. Here's where most modern readers make their fundamental error. They assume that because we now live in an age of supposed intellectual freedom, the ancients must have enjoyed similar liberty. This assumption blinds us to the sophisticated literary techniques that Plato, Aristotle, and others developed to communicate dangerous truths while protecting themselves and their communities from the destructive potential of those same truths. Socrates, after all, was executed for corrupting the youth and introducing new gods. His student Plato learned this lesson well. When Plato writes his dialogues, he never appears as a character, never directly endorses any position, and always presents philosophical arguments through the mouth of dramatic characters whose reliability we must evaluate. The surface teaching often serves the city's needs, while the deeper teaching serves the philosopher's quest for truth. Chapter 2: Reading Plato's Contradictions as Philosophical Guidance. Let me show you how this works in practice by examining Plato's Republic, perhaps the most misunderstood book in the entire Western tradition. Most readers see it as a blueprint for an ideal state, complete with philosopher kings, communism of wives and property, and rigid class divisions. But careful reading reveals that Plato systematically undermines every major proposal he seems to endorse. Consider the famous allegory of the cave. On the surface, it appears to support the rule of philosopher kings. Those who have seen the truth should return to govern those still trapped in illusion. But look more carefully. What happens to the philosopher who returns to the cave? The prisoners attempt to kill him. Plato explicitly tells us that the philosopher is poorly adapted to political life, that he stumbles in the darkness, that the prisoners mock his incompetence. Is this really an endorsement of philosopher kings, or is it a warning about the impossibility of combining philosophy and politics? Throughout the Republic, Plato presents a city that is supposed to be just, but every feature of this city violates what we normally understand as justice. The guardians are told noble lies about their origins. Children are separated from their parents. Private property is abolished for the ruling class while maintained for the producers. The city requires constant war to remain unified. Does this sound like justice, or does it sound like tyranny disguised as justice? But here's the deeper point: Plato isn't advocating for this city. He's showing us what happens when we try to make the perfect the enemy of the good, when we pursue absolute justice rather than practical wisdom. The ideal city of the Republic is deliberately impossible and undesirable, designed to teach us about the limits of political reform and the dangers of utopian thinking. The dialogue's dramatic structure supports this reading. Notice that Socrates presents these radical proposals not to thoughtful interlocutors, but to young men who are easily impressed by bold assertions. Glaucon and Adeimantus want simple answers to complex questions. Socrates gives them exactly what they ask for, and thereby demonstrates why such answers are dangerous. The real teaching of the Republic isn't about the ideal state, it's about the proper relationship between philosophy and politics, about why the philosophical life represents a higher form of justice than any political arrangement, and about why wisdom lies in understanding the limits of political possibility rather than in pursuing perfect solutions. Chapter 3: The Modern Failure to Recognize Ancient Wisdom. Now I must ask you directly, how have you been reading classical texts? Have you approached them as historical artifacts, interesting primarily for understanding how people thought in the past? Have you read them as crude early attempts at systematic philosophy, valuable mainly as stepping stones to more sophisticated modern thought? If so, you've fallen victim to the most destructive prejudice of our age, the assumption that intellectual progress is automatic and that newer is necessarily better. This historicist approach to classical texts assumes that ancient philosophers were limited by their historical circumstances, that they lacked our advanced methods and sophisticated understanding. From this perspective, we can appreciate Plato and Aristotle as pioneers, but we don't expect to learn anything fundamentally new from them. After all, haven't we surpassed them in our knowledge of psychology, economics, sociology, and political science? But this approach makes a fatal error. It confuses technical progress with wisdom. Yes, we know more about the mechanisms of heredity than Aristotle did. Yes, we have more sophisticated statistical methods than Plato possessed. But do we understand human nature better? Do we have clearer insight into the permanent problems of political life? Do we possess greater wisdom about how to live well? The historicist reading treats philosophical texts as products of their time, explicable in terms of social forces, economic conditions, and cultural assumptions. But this approach makes genuine philosophical dialogue impossible. If Plato's ideas are merely reflections of Greek slave society, if Aristotle's politics simply rationalize aristocratic privilege, then we can't learn from them. We can only study them as specimens of outdated thinking. The consequences of this approach extend far beyond academic interpretation. When we lose the ability to engage seriously with ancient wisdom, we lose access to insights that remain valid precisely because they address permanent features of human nature and political life. We become trapped in the assumptions of our own age, unable to achieve the critical distance necessary for genuine self-knowledge. Consider what we've lost by treating ancient texts as merely historical documents. We've lost Aristotle's understanding of friendship as a political phenomenon, his insight that community depends on shared virtue rather than shared interests. We've lost Plato's recognition that justice in the soul and justice in the city are related problems, that political reform without personal reform is impossible. We've lost the classical understanding that democracy tends toward tyranny when it abandons the pursuit of excellence in favor of the equality of all opinions. Chapter 4: Ancient Diagnosis of Modern Political Crisis. The classical texts, when read with proper suspicion and care, provide resources for understanding contemporary political problems that modern social science cannot match. This isn't nostalgia or romantic attachment to the past, it's recognition that ancient philosophers grasped permanent features of political life that we've forgotten in our pursuit of technical solutions to human problems. Take Aristotle's analysis of democracy in the Politics. He doesn't simply praise or condemn democratic government, he analyzes its inherent tendencies, its characteristic virtues and vices, its inevitable trajectory when left unchecked by constitutional restraints and moral education. Aristotle understood that democracy tends to evolve from rule by the many in the common interest toward rule by the poor in their particular interest. He saw that democratic equality, taken to its logical conclusion, undermines the very foundations of political authority. Modern political science studies voting behavior, interest group activity, and institutional procedures. But it cannot address the fundamental question that concerned Aristotle: what type of regime is most conducive to human flourishing? Modern approaches assume that all political arrangements are essentially equivalent, that institutions are merely neutral tools that can be used for any purpose. But Aristotle understood that different regimes shape different types of human character, that political institutions are inevitably moral institutions, whether we acknowledge this or not. Consider how Aristotelian insights illuminate contemporary democratic malaise. We see the rise of populist movements that claim to represent the people against corrupt elites. We witness the polarization of political discourse, the breakdown of shared civic virtues, the triumph of private interest over common good. We observe the tendency of democratic politicians to promise more than they can deliver, to appeal to passion rather than reason, to treat citizens as consumers of government services rather than participants in self-governance. Aristotle predicted all of this. He understood that democracy without constitutional restraints becomes mob rule, that equality without recognition of natural differences leads to the tyranny of mediocrity, that freedom without virtue degenerates into license. But he also provided resources for addressing these problems, not through institutional tinkering, but through moral education and constitutional design based on realistic understanding of human nature. The same applies to Plato's insights about the relationship between individual character and political order. We can't solve political problems through better policies alone, because political problems reflect deeper problems in the human soul. Until we address questions of virtue, wisdom, and the proper ordering of human desires, our political reforms will remain superficial. Chapter 5: The Tension Between Philosophy and Faith. Let me address directly the relationship between philosophical inquiry and religious belief, a relationship that remains as fraught today as it was in the time of Maimonides or Thomas Aquinas. How many of you have wrestled with apparent conflicts between what reason discovers and what faith teaches? How many have felt forced to choose between intellectual honesty and spiritual commitment? This tension isn't accidental, and it can't be resolved through superficial harmony or easy synthesis. The great medieval philosophers understood that reason and revelation sometimes point in different directions, that Athens and Jerusalem represent different approaches to the most fundamental questions about human existence. They didn't try to eliminate this tension, they learned to live creatively within it. But here's what the medieval masters discovered: the tension between philosophy and theology is itself philosophically and theologically instructive. When Maimonides writes about the conflict between Aristotelian philosophy and biblical teaching, he's not simply trying to reconcile opposing viewpoints. He's exploring what this conflict reveals about the limits of human reason, the nature of divine transcendence, and the different types of knowledge appropriate to different human capacities. Consider how this applies to contemporary debates about science and religion. Most participants assume they must choose sides, either scientific materialism is correct and religious belief is superstition, or religious truth is primary and science must be subordinated to faith. But this forced choice reflects precisely the kind of superficial thinking that esoteric writing is designed to overcome. The deeper question is whether human reason, even at its most sophisticated, can address the ultimate questions that religion attempts to answer. Can science tell us why there is something rather than nothing? Can it explain the existence of moral obligations? Can it account for the human capacity to transcend immediate self-interest in pursuit of truth or justice? If not, then perhaps the tension between reason and revelation reflects real limitations in human knowledge rather than simple intellectual confusion. This doesn't mean we should abandon rational inquiry or retreat into fideism. It means we should approach both philosophy and theology with appropriate humility, recognizing that the most important questions may exceed our capacity for definitive answers. The medieval philosophers developed sophisticated methods for pursuing truth within these constraints, methods that remain relevant for anyone who takes both reason and faith seriously. The art of esoteric writing emerges partly from this recognition. When philosophers must address audiences that include both believers and skeptics, both those capable of following complex arguments and those who need simple truths, they develop techniques for communicating different messages to different readers within the same text. Chapter 6: The Philosopher's Responsibility for Dangerous Truths. Now we approach perhaps the most uncomfortable question raised by the art of esoteric writing. Are there truths that should not be publicly proclaimed? Are there insights that, while valid, could prove destructive if widely accepted? This question cuts to the heart of the philosopher's responsibility to society and reveals why the greatest thinkers have always written with careful attention to their potential audience. Consider what happens when philosophical critique undermines the foundations of social order. If the philosopher demonstrates that conventional moral beliefs lack rational foundation, that political authority rests on opinion rather than knowledge, that traditional religious teachings cannot withstand rigorous examination, what are the consequences for social stability? Can society function when its organizing principles are revealed as arbitrary constructions rather than eternal truths? Plato explores this problem throughout his dialogues. In the Euthyphro, Socrates systematically destroys traditional concepts of piety, showing that popular religious beliefs rest on confusion and contradiction. But notice that this dialogue takes place just before Socrates' trial for impiety. Plato seems to be showing us that philosophical criticism of religion, however intellectually sound, can have dangerous social consequences. The same pattern appears in political philosophy. Careful analysis reveals that all political authority ultimately rests on force, that concepts like justice and the common good are interpreted by those with power to serve their own interests, that the distinction between legitimate government and organized crime is often harder to maintain than we like to admit. These insights may be true, but what happens to political order when citizens fully grasp them? This doesn't mean philosophers should lie or suppress important truths. It means they must learn to communicate responsibly, taking account of the different capacities and needs of their audiences. Some individuals can handle radical criticism of conventional beliefs without becoming cynical or destructive. Others need stable moral and political frameworks to live decent lives. The art of esoteric writing allows philosophers to serve both groups simultaneously. Modern thinkers often reject this approach as elitist or manipulative. They insist that all truths should be public, that everyone has a right to complete information, that democratic society requires transparency in all areas. But this position ignores the genuine tension between the requirements of philosophical inquiry and the needs of political community. It assumes that what serves the philosopher's quest for understanding will automatically serve society's need for stability and cooperation. Experience suggests otherwise. The widespread acceptance of moral relativism, for example, may reflect intellectual sophistication, but it also undermines the shared standards necessary for social cooperation. The public recognition that political authority lacks transcendent justification may represent clear thinking, but it also weakens the civic loyalty that democratic institutions require. Chapter 7: The Return to Careful Reading as Liberation. After years of teaching students to read suspiciously, to look for contradictions and hidden meanings, to question every apparent argument, I can report something remarkable. Those who master the art of esoteric reading become more rather than less capable of independent thought. Learning to suspect every classical text doesn't produce cynicism, it produces sophisticated judgment. Understanding how great philosophers conceal dangerous truths doesn't undermine respect for truth, it deepens appreciation for the complex relationship between knowledge and wisdom. Why does this happen? Because the careful reader develops intellectual virtues that serve him well beyond the study of ancient texts. He learns to distinguish between surface arguments and deeper insights, between what authors claim to believe and what they actually demonstrate, between positions designed for public consumption and teachings intended for serious students. These skills prove invaluable for navigating contemporary intellectual life, where sophisticated forms of concealment and misdirection operate constantly. Consider how advertising, political rhetoric, academic discourse, and popular entertainment all employ techniques of persuasion that obscure as much as they reveal. The student trained in esoteric reading recognizes these techniques and develops resistance to manipulation. He learns to ask not just, "What is this author saying?" but, "Why is he saying it this way?" and, "What is he not saying directly?" But the benefits extend beyond critical thinking skills. The return to careful reading of great texts provides access to a quality of intellectual life that modernity has largely abandoned. When you read Plato's Phaedrus with attention to its dramatic structure, its apparent contradictions, and its multiple levels of meaning, you participate in a form of inquiry that engages your whole mind rather than just your analytical faculties. You develop patience for complex arguments, tolerance for uncertainty, and appreciation for the subtle relationships between different forms of knowledge. This type of reading also cultivates practical wisdom. The great texts don't just present abstract theories, they explore how theoretical insights apply to concrete human situations. Aristotle's Ethics doesn't simply define virtue, it shows how virtuous action requires the ability to perceive particular circumstances accurately and respond appropriately. Plato's Republic doesn't just analyze justice, it demonstrates how the pursuit of perfect justice can lead to injustice. Perhaps most importantly, serious engagement with classical texts provides critical perspective on contemporary assumptions. When you understand how Aristotle analyzes the relationship between democracy and tyranny, you're less likely to accept simplistic claims about the inherent superiority of democratic institutions. When you grasp Plato's insights about the tension between philosophy and politics, you're better equipped to evaluate contemporary proposals for technocratic governance or philosopher kings. The return to great books isn't escape from contemporary problems, it's preparation for addressing those problems with greater wisdom and sophistication. The ancients faced the same fundamental challenges we face: how to organize political communities, how to balance freedom and order, how to cultivate virtue in an age of moral confusion, how to seek truth while maintaining social stability. Their solutions may not apply directly to our circumstances, but their methods of analysis remain invaluable. Conclusion. The art of reading classical texts with proper suspicion opens a door that can never again be closed. Once you learn to see the contradictions in Plato's Republic as deliberate teaching devices rather than logical errors, once you understand how Aristotle's apparent conventional opinions conceal more radical insights, once you grasp why Maimonides warns his readers about the contradictions in his own work, you possess a key to unlocking treasures that have remained hidden for centuries. But this discovery comes with responsibility. Those who learn to read esoterically must decide how to use this knowledge, whether to share dangerous truths indiscriminately or to follow the example of the great philosophers by teaching with prudence and care. The choice between the easy path of intellectual conformism and the demanding adventure of genuine philosophical inquiry remains as relevant today as it was in ancient Athens. The texts are waiting. The question is whether you have the courage to read them as they were written, not as simple historical documents, but as sophisticated communications from minds that understood truths too dangerous for public proclamation, yet too important for private concealment.